Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, and I'm the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. Welcome this evening to our talk by Ambassador Bill Taylor, a senior career Foreign Service officer and an old friend of mine. Bill Taylor is now the Vice President for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute for Peace, federal think tank that's independent of the federal government. In 2019, he served as the Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw the U.S. assistance program in support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. Ambassador Taylor also served as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, which facilitated the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. He served in Baghdad as the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office from 2004 to 2005, and in Kabul as the coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan from 2002 to 2003. There, of course, in both cases, we dealt with Bill on a daily basis, and he's one of my favorite diplomats, actually. Ambassador Taylor was also the coordinator of all U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union, Russia, and Eastern Europe, and the Central Asian republics. He served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey many years ago. He's a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and served as an infantry platoon leader in combat company commander in U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. After Ambassador Taylor speaks, he will then answer questions which many of you have sent in. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Andrew, first of all, let me thank you in particular, the Scowcroft Institute more generally, and the community there more broadly for this opportunity. This is an honor for me. It's an opportunity for me to have this conversation. I mentioned to Andrew and Zhenya just before we all got on that I'm really looking forward to the second half of this hour, or however long we have, the second part of this discussion, because that's your questions, and I want to be sure I'm responsive to your questions and your interests as we go along. What I thought I would do, Andrew, Zhenya, if it's all right with you, is talk about the current situation. Probably most people at the Scowcroft Institute are following this issue pretty carefully. So I'll talk a little bit about that from the Ukrainian standpoint, from the Russian standpoint, and from the United States and our allies standpoint. I'll then try to sketch out a little bit of where things could go from here. Andrew and Zhenya sent me some of the questions that many of you have submitted, and there are a good number of questions that ask that question. Okay, where are we going? What happens next? What do you think? And of course, I don't know, but I can help us kind of think through some possibilities, some scenarios. There were several questions there in this list, a long list, I will say, of questions that one way or the other asked, why should we care? Why are we here talking about Ukraine in Texas or in Virginia or wherever we're zooming in from? Why does this matter to the United States? And I think this is a very important question that I will give you my cut. I'll tell you why I think. Andrew's probably got some thoughts on this, which I would love to hear. You all clearly have some thoughts on this. I can tell by the tenor of the questions that there are some views about this, about why this matters. What's in it for us? Why are we thinking about this, and maybe even doing something about this? Those are excellent questions. If that is okay, I will shoot to be fairly concise and go for no more than 20 or 30 minutes max, and then over to you for questions. Those many questions that I will not have answered that you've got. Current situation. The immediate situation is that there are probably about 200,000 Russian troops that have now gone from the borders where they assembled over the past 2 months and are now in Ukraine. I got a briefing today, so you'll be happy to know that the White House and Defense Department gives regular briefings on this issue. And the briefing today was very clear that 100% of the forces that the President Putin had assembled on the Ukrainian border and Ukrainian borders, because it was the north and the. I'll get. Fact is, Jenny, why don't we flash up the map just for a second? Everybody can take a look as we do this. So there were 200. There we go. All right. So 200,000 troops on the northern border, and you can see the northern border of Ukraine there with Belarus. There you are. Thank you, Jenny. Great work. Great work. You'd think we practiced this. This is. Then there is the long border that Russia has with Ukraine, and it goes there from Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv. We heard a lot about Kharkiv, down to all the way over to Luhansk and Donetsk, where since the Russians first invaded in 2014, let's keep that in mind. This war has been going on since 2014, since the Russians first invaded Ukraine, and Luhansk and Donetsk have been occupied, and there are these small little puppet governments that are there, and they play a role here. So we'll come back to that. Going on down around the southern part of Ukraine, there Mariupol, which we'll talk about, Berdyansk, and then the Crimean Peninsula, all the way down there we are, the southern part. And also in 2014, the Russians invaded Crimea, and they have put forces in there, and so they have. There's 200,000 troops that I mentioned that are on all three borders. There's one more, actually. Zhenya knows about this last border. All three borders, 200,000. But thank you. So over in Moldova, where Zhenya's from, there are also some Russian troops in Transnistria. And Russian troops have been in Transnistria since the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, 1992. And so you've really got these troops, this military force that was poised to invade and now has invaded. And now, as we know, they are moving. Okay, Zhenya, back up to where it says Chernobyl. So up in the north, Belarus, there we are. So that's one avenue of approach from Belarus down towards Kyiv. You can see the capital of Kyiv. That is the goal of the military action, and the Russians are moving large portions of this 200,000 soldier force down towards Kyiv from the north, from Chernobyl, also from Sumy. Sumy is surrounded and is being pummeled by aircraft, by long-range artillery, and by short-range artillery, so direct fire. Kharkiv, the next one down, is also in danger of falling to the Russians, and this pincer movement, this movement from the east, from Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv towards Kyiv, and then coming down from the north towards Kyiv. Now shift your attention down to Crimea, where the forces are moving north out of Crimea, and some are turning to the east towards Berdyansk and Mariupol, where they have surrounded Mariupol, and the Ukrainian forces are defending valiantly, I will tell you, but it's an uphill battle. It's David and Goliath. It's 10-1 odds in almost every theater, and almost every one of these avenues of approach. And Mariupol will probably fall sometime soon. Go back to Crimea, and the forces, in addition to coming out of Crimea and turning east, they are also turning to the west, and they have captured Kherson, right exactly where Zhenya is pointing, and you can see over the big port, Odessa, is under threat, and the naval forces, the Russian naval forces, are poised to complement, to reinforce the ground forces that are coming over from Crimea, Kherson in the direction of Odessa. So that's kind of the military situation. Let me say a little bit about the Ukrainian forces. And Zhenya, that's probably good for the map. We may want to pull the map up again, but I'll go back so I can see everybody, see if I'm losing anybody on this discussion. So far, I'm not. I got good eye contact for all these people. Wish I were there, by the way, Andrew. I'm very sorry not to be there, but
we'll have you later. We'll have you visit later.
I look forward to it. Although we'll never get this kind of crowd because, as we were saying, timing is everything for this discussion. So the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. Let me just say a little bit of it. Now, I will tell you, as Andrew mentioned, I served in Ukraine from 2006, 2009, got to know Ukrainians, got to know the country, made a lot of good friends, many of whom I've stayed in touch with all this time. And as Andrew said, also, I went back. I went back as kind of acting ambassador, chargé d'affaires, as Andrew said, in 2019. Reacquainted with a lot of good friends, met a lot of new friends, and met at that time, then the brand new president of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky. And President Zelensky, when I got back in 2019, got back to Kyiv in June of 2019, had just been elected overwhelmingly. He won in a landslide, a free and fair election. Andrew knows about elections and how they can be stolen sometimes. Well, this one wasn't. This was free and fair. And he won 73%. Now, when have you last heard of free and fair election? They got 73% of the vote. Well, that's what this man got. President Volodymyr Zelensky won that in a landslide. And the amazing thing, he was running against an incumbent. He was running against the previous president. And as Andrew again knows, a lot of people on the screen, I'm sure know, the incumbent president has a lot of power, a lot of ability to have influence on elections, let's just say, in this country too. Let's just be clear. And so for an upstart, a young businessman who is actually a show business person, he's actually a comedian with no political experience. He had never held elective office before. President Volodymyr Zelensky was elected with 73% of the vote. And when I got there, he just taken office. I had a good opportunity to have good conversation with him over the following 6-7 months. He is now well known to everybody on the screen, I am sure. Yeah, he has stepped up. He has emerged as not only a national hero in Ukraine, not only has he unified the country behind him in this fight against the Russians, not only does he have the loyalty of the commitment of the Ukrainian military, he's also stepped up on the international stage, and he is inspiring governments, presidents, people, citizens around the world in his commitment, in his bravery, in his courage to stay in that capital of Kyiv that we showed you on the map. That is, with all these forces coming from the north, coming from the northeast, coming from the south up towards Kyiv, President Zelensky has resolved, is determined, and has said he's not leaving Kyiv. He's staying there. And we're going to talk about kind of what that might mean. But for now, my main point is, while we're talking about the Ukrainian side, President Zelensky has emerged as a national hero. He has emerged as an unlikely hero. I mean, again, he was very popular when he was elected, but as happens with all politicians, as they go through the first and second year, their popularity goes down. That happened to him. People started to complain about this and that. There were real opposition parties. There are real opposition parties. I will just say, again, Andrew is an authority on this. Ukraine's a real democracy. Ukraine is a real democracy, and it has real politics. It has all the problems of real democracies and real politics that we know. and that other democracies around the world know. And he faced, for the first 2 years, year and a half that he was in office, some real opposition, some real political opposition. They were strong political parties. That former president that he whipped in the presidential election is back. He's now leading a party, and he was, up until about 4 weeks ago, strongly opposed to President Zelensky and what he was doing. But now President Zelensky has unified the opposition as well as his own party, as well as the nation, and he is standing very tough. That's number one. Number two, the Ukrainian military. Again, this is David and Goliath. I mean, this is 10 to 1 in any measure, that and 10 to 100 to 1 in many measures of equipment, of manpower, of budgets, of sophistication, of weapons. It is not certainly not a fair fight. No one thought it would be a fair fight, but everyone knew that it was going to be overwhelming, that the Russians, the overwhelming power and overmatch, as they say. However, here we are on day 13. The expectations was that enormous overmatch of Russians against the Ukrainian military. They'd be in Kyiv in a day and a half or 2 days max. And here we are 13 days out, and they are stalled. And that stall is because, number one, because of the Ukrainian military. It's tough. They've been fighting the Russians since 2014. For 8 years, they've got combat experience, but they're also committed. They are really committed to defending their land, their country. I'm not trying to be mawkish here. They're defending their freedom, literally. They are defending their nation, and they've got that motivation. In contrast to the Russians, and I'm going to talk about the Russians in a minute. I don't want to go too long here. I've got my eye on the clock here, Andrew. But the Ukrainians have stopped this advance, in particular the one I mentioned from the north. The others are moving. The other columns of Russians are moving towards Kyiv. And sooner or later, they will probably get there. And then there'll be decision time. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Let me just say a quick word about the Russians. Several people have asked the question, why? Why did the Russians invade Ukraine? Ukraine, several people have noticed, Ukraine had been, a normal country, a friendly country. There were, the Russians and Ukrainians, their history is intertwined back over centuries. Just to be clear, by the way, the Ukrainian history goes back farther than the Russian history. We can come back to that. But the Ukrainians, as Zhenya will attest, the Ukrainians have a longer history. They go back to the 9th century, whereas, when the Ukrainians were building a beautiful cathedral in the middle of Kyiv in the 10th century, Moscow was a forest. There was no Moscow. And here's the Kievan Rus society civilization was building this amazing cathedral, St. Sophia's, in the middle of Kyiv. So the Russians, why did they invade? What was in it for President Putin? There's nothing in it for the Russian people that anyone can see. In fact, the Russian people are not supporting this by and large. The Russian people are listening to the propaganda, and the Russian people know what their government tells them that they must know, and they say what they must say. But the number of protests and the number of people arrested, number of protesters who are arrested in Russia for protesting against this war is growing dramatically. And there are increasing signs that the Russian people do not support this. And it's going to get worse for them, because two things are going to happen. They've already started happening. Number one, by some estimates, there have already been 2,000 to 4,000 Russian soldiers die. And they're going to go home to their villages and towns across Russia, and they're going to be buried. And the Russian families who lost sons and daughters, brothers and fathers, are going to ask, why are we losing our family members? Why is the president sending our brothers and sisters going into a friendly country that we've known for a long time? These are our cousins, these are our business partners, these are our friends, and there's unprovoked attack, unjustified attack. President Putin tried to find a justification and he couldn't. He tried to manufacture a justification. He tried to get the Ukrainians to attack him. They wouldn't. There's no reason for this. There is no reason. We can talk about why I think President Putin may have done this, but there's no good reason. There is no justifiable reason. In the UN, Andrew knows something about the UN, big up in that part of the country. There was a vote first in the Security Council. And it was 11-1. And the one, of course, was Russia. So they vetoed the resolution of condemnation in the Security Council. So they took it to the United Nations General Assembly. And it was 141-5. 141 nations said, this is unacceptable. This is unprovoked. They didn't say this is a crime. This is wrong. We'll come to the crime business later. It is a crime, and we'll talk about kind of war criminal. But 141 nations condemned Russia. Russia got, Cuba, Syria, North Korea, Eritrea. For some reason, can't figure this out. So the Russians they didn't even get China. China abstained. So the Russians are isolated. Putin is isolated. So it goes back. Why? Why is he doing this? The first reason that the Russian people are getting angry is because their sons and daughters are coming back for burial. The second reason is the economic sanctions, and this gets kind of into the U.S. version, the U.S. part of this discussion. The U.S. Has led a coalition to put economic sanctions on the Russians. We promised them first in trying to deter this invasion. It failed. He invaded anyway. President Biden told President Putin very clearly what the sanctions were going to be, and President Putin invaded anyway. So he knew what was coming, and now these sanctions are hammering the Russian economy. We can go into details of this. Again, I'd love to talk about this in the Q&A. I won't go into detail, but the ruble is worthless. The ruble used to be 1-to-1 with the dollar. Now it's less than a penny. Now it's 151 to the dollar. So the ruble is worthless, and Russian people are suffering. It's sad. Russian families, normal Russian families, are suffering because of what President Putin is doing, and he's paying that price. He's paying that price. So I won't try to answer the question that I got a bunch about. Well, why do you think President Putin invaded? Well, I've got some theories. I don't know this man. Some people think he's a little bit unhinged who have seen him recently. Others think he's rational. But again, when we start talking about the nuclear dimension, we'll come back to that question as well. So let me just, I've said a little bit already about the United States and the NATO allies being unified. I didn't actually put it that way, but that's what I was getting at when I said the United States led a coalition to put on these sanctions, led a coalition to defend Ukraine by providing weapons and by increasing the strength of our military on the border, on the NATO's border, the eastern flank of NATO, where Poland and Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria and Slovak border on Ukraine, and those nations are on the front line with Ukraine, and the United States has pulled together that NATO alliance and the European Union and the international alliance. I mean, we're talking about Japan and Australia and India as well. I mean, this is an alliance that has put sanctions on President Putin and has bolstered the strength of the Ukrainian military. Let me do a little bit, Andrew. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I'm going to do just a little bit on scenarios and then a little bit on why I think Ukraine's important. Scenarios. One scenario is, we've already talked about it, that is the Russians finally grind down the Ukrainian military. They haven't been able to do it for 13 days, but they've got a whole lot of power, and they might be able to actually do that. And if they do, if they can get to Kyiv, then they either surround it and squeeze it, starve it, strangle it by not letting people out and not letting supplies in, and finally they take it over. Or they do like they did in Grozny, where the Russians just leveled the place. This is heart-wrenching to even contemplate. I mentioned St. Sophia's. That's only one of hundreds of beautiful structures, cathedrals, places of. It's a wonderful city, and to imagine that it could be leveled, it could be destroyed, is just it's beyond belief. But that's what the Russians have done in a couple of places. They've done it in Aleppo. They've done it in Grozny. And in both of those cases, it was Putin. So it's very possible. I despair to think that that could happen to Kyiv, but it could. And one scenario is he takes over Kyiv one way or the other. The worst case, he somehow takes control of, to be kind, President Zelensky, whom I talked about. And in President Zelensky's place, Putin puts in a puppet, puts in somebody, you know, the Russians have done this. The Soviets have done this. They did this in East Europe. We remember during the Cold War. They know how to do this. They did this in Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk. They put in their puppets that they can control. And that's what this one scenario that President Putin would try to do. And in that case, in that scenario, the Ukrainian people will reject it. The Ukrainian people will do what they've done 2 times in the past 20 years, and that is go to the streets, civil disobey. They will not be ruled by this puppet. They will stay in the streets and they will shut the place down in that scenario. And the Russians, if they try this scenario, if they get to this scenario and they think they're going to occupy the country and suppress all of this protest, they don't have the people. They don't have the military. They don't have the soldiers to do that. They probably need 2 or 3 million, and they've got 200,000 right now. They won't be able to. So that's the first scenario. A more optimistic scenario, the one that I want to still try for and hope for, is that. Well, the best scenario is the Ukrainian military pushes the Russians back. This is, I will tell you, I've been accused of being an optimist. That's really optimistic for the Russian, but the Ukrainian military so far, 13 days they've held them off and pushed back in some cases. So it's that's a good sign. And I've mentioned the problems that President Putin has. In some scenarios. Someone in the Kremlin decides that President Putin is unhinged, is not well, is not making rational decisions or making even decisions that make sense from a Russian standpoint. And somebody decides, we can do it better. Some Russian leader in the Kremlin decides we can do it better. And this has happened before in the Soviet times. Succession in Russia and something not pretty. That's a possibility. So some combination of the Ukrainian military does very well, or there's a change in Moscow, change in policy, or in the Ukrainian military does very well. President Putin decides, actually, I think there's a negotiated settlement here. I think I can find a way to compromise, and maybe I don't really need to take over all of Ukraine right now. Maybe I can do that later, and I'll have conversations, negotiations. There have been some negotiations already on the border between Belarus and Ukraine. 3 rounds. I've been in touch with 2 of the people who lead that, and they're not convinced it's serious yet, but it could be serious. There's a negotiation scenario you take a look at. One last one, Andrew, and then I will wrap up with why we should care. The last scenario is President Zelensky, despite having stuck to the bitter end in Kyiv, and he has resisted leaving the capital. And for that, he has gotten the undying devotion and loyalty of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. At some point, he may have to leave. Ukrainians don't like this scenario to hear about his leaving. But my point here is there will be, in this scenario, a Ukrainian government. And it is this Ukrainian government. It's either President Zelensky or his successor or his successor's successor. And it may be in Kyiv. It may be in the southwestern part of the country where there are mountains and there are no Russian troops yet. And again, the Russians would have a hard time going all the way all over the country, including into the West. And so that government is a legitimate government that the UN recognizes, that the United States recognizes, that Europe recognizes, that the whole world, except probably Russia, recognizes. And we will continue to support it. We will continue to provide weapons. We'll continue to provide funding. We'll continue to provide security, political support. This is not without precedent. I reminded people that during the Cold War, East Germany and West Germany were divided. The Soviets controlled East Germany. West Germany went on to be a very successful democracy and joined the European Union, helped form the European Union and join NATO. And while East Germany was left behind. And that could happen in this scenario with Ukraine. That is, the western part of Ukraine under President Zelensky or his successor or successor's successor could continue to develop a democracy that joins Europe, could join the European Union, could join NATO. It could continue to exist and be recognized and continue to resist. It will resist the Russians in every case. Those hundreds of thousands, those millions, those tens of millions of Ukrainians who will be in the street under that first scenario I talked about, where they install a puppet, the Russians, they will be out as well in the eastern part of in this scenario, the occupied part of. This is resistance. I don't want to talk about insurgency. That implies something different. But this is resistance, not an insurgency, because it's a legitimate government. Okay, last 2 minutes on Colonel Caldwell. All right, I'll come back to these questions in the chat. Why do we care? Why do we care? There are a range of reasons, and there are people on this call who could probably, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Some people don't care. I got that message from some of these questions. Some people say, why are we even having this conversation? I'll tell you why I care. Ukraine is on the front line. It is on the front line, not by choice, but the Russians have brought this unprovoked, unjustified war to Ukraine. So it's defending itself. It's also defending Europe in some real sense. The Russians want, and they have said, they want a sphere of influence that starts with Ukraine. It doesn't stop with Ukraine. The people, Zhenya's from Moldova. Moldova is very vulnerable. There are probably here people on this call with family in the Baltic states, in Lithuania, and Latvia, and Estonia. They are vulnerable. The fact that Ukraine is on the front line and it is defending the rest of Europe by itself. We have no soldiers there, and we're not sending soldiers there. It's fighting against the Russians by itself on our behalf. And the reason it's important that it succeeds, and this is why I think we are here having this conversation, the reason important it succeeds is the only way we're going to get back to some kind of order, some kind of peaceful Europe, is if we recognize the sovereignty of nations. If we recognize that Ukraine, in this instance, is sovereign, it gets to decide the rules that we lived by, that the Russians lived by, and the Soviets before them lived by, and all of Europe lived by, the United States and NATO lived by, recognized sovereignty, and that kept the peace for about 69 years, from 1945 until 2014, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, when that broke the peace. But there was a period of time there, it wasn't sweetness and light, it wasn't perfect. There were conflicts. We remember the Balkans, but there were no major wars like we're seeing right now. And in order to get back to some order, we need for Ukraine to succeed and not allow Russia to impose a sphere of influence and impose the rule that might makes right. That's not the way the world or Europe or the United States wants to have as a place to live. So that's the important. Last thing I'll say on this is more of a moral argument, and that is, like I say, Ukraine's on the front line. Everyone on this call, I suspect, would agree with me that Americans support our troops. We support our soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen. And they are on our front line. They are fighting our wars. We're not fighting their wars, our wars. They are defending us. And Ukraine's defending us as well. And we should support them because they are on the front line of their fight that they didn't pick, the front line of Europe, front line of Democrats against autocrats. This is an important fight, and I believe that we should support them. And I'll be glad, Andrew, to go to questions that you and Jenya can show up for me.
Well, let me ask you. Let me just bring up a couple of other points here with respect to Vladimir Putin. If you read the scholarly literature, Frank Myers wrote a biography. I think his name is Myers. It's the best biography. And he came and spoke at the Bush School. We had a conference on Putin, and he said Putin is a pragmatist. I said no, he's not a pragmatist. He's actually much more dangerous than that, in my view. I think that the scholarly community of the United States has misinterpreted who this guy is. Okay, I think he's a spy who's disguised his intentions all these years because the Russian military was so weak, their armaments were in such terrible shape. He's built up the treasury, $650 billion in the sovereign wealth fund, and he was waiting for the opportunity. I think he made a terrible misjudgment here. He assumed by our reckless, in my view, and chaotic departure from Afghanistan that meant we were withdrawing from the rest of the world. I thought it was disgraceful the way we left Afghanistan. And other countries saw that. I mean, this notion that you can do something in one country and it has no effect on what happens to the rest is complete nonsense. Everybody sees what we do everywhere and they make judgments on it. And they made a judgment that we were weak and that we could be run over. And that's exactly what he tried to do. Now, there are some people who say that the agreement that was signed in, I think it was the 21st of November, which moved Ukraine along in the path toward NATO membership, is the last draw for Putin. I actually don't think that Putin does not like NATO, not because he feels threatened for it. I don't believe that. That's what he's saying in public. I think what he wants is he wants to dictate what happens in Europe. He doesn't like the EU because it's so rich and powerful economically. He doesn't like NATO because it used to be much more powerful. It's gotten weakened. And the thing that he's done that's extraordinary is he has done something we could not do, which is reunite the West. It's a disastrous calculation on his part. If he really feels threatened by NATO, the worst thing he ever did was to invade Ukraine, because he's now united the thing that he's afraid of. And the fact that Sweden and Finland are now thinking of joining NATO is extraordinary. The polling data did not support that before now, and now it's 2-1 vote in both countries. And then he tries to intimidate them. You know, you're going to be sorry if you join NATO. And so I do think he's made a series of miscalculations. I think he's attempting to reestablish the Russian Empire and Russia as a great power. The problem with that is Russia's not China. They're a failing state. We published a series of essays in 2018. By the way, the scholars who read the essay said we were so ominous about Putin that we were regarded as too dark, and that they didn't want to publish the articles. We called major press last week, and they said we want to publish the articles. Okay, that we published them in a small journal, and no one's read them. Okay. And they take a very dark view of who Vladimir Putin is and what his intentions are. And so I think that he's dangerous, and I don't think he's irrational. I mean, he's got a calculation, he's got a goal, he's got a grand strategy. We simply ignored it all these years. And I might add, it's not just here, it's in Europe. I asked my friends in Western Europe, aren't you a little nervous about Putin? This is before the military buildup and the invasion. I said, aren't you nervous about the Poles are nervous, the Baltic states are nervous. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And no, Andrew, people don't exaggerate. He's a pragmatist. We can deal with him and all that. I said, you're making a very big mistake. Now they're all in panic because the only thing that stands between them and the Russian army is a bunch of trees because the Europeans have disarmed over the years, and they've relied on us, and we withdraw troops.
The Ukrainian military is also standing between them.
Yes, it is, and they are protecting us.
They are.
People don't realize our biggest trading partner is not China; it's Europe, and they're democracies. They're our allies. There were half our country came from Europe, for heaven's sake. So to say we're going to abandon Europe is my view madness to do. We did that once before in the late 1930s. Hitler rampaged across Europe, and we were drawn into eventually. And we lost hundreds of thousands of troops. 70 million people died in the Second World War. We want that to happen again. I mean, especially with nuclear weapons now. So I am not supposed to be dominating this, Bill, but no, I'm as upset as you are on this. And I'm not being objective, and I recognize that. But anyway, let's go.
Andrew. So, you can tell I'm not being objective either. I'm not trying to on the one hand, no. There's a right, and this is an important point in my view. And I'd be interested if people disagree or there's a right and a wrong here. This is an easy one. I fought in a hard one. I fought in Vietnam. That was a hard one. This is not hard. This is right and wrong. This is very clear. And no one knows this better than Larry Napper, who I see in the upper left-hand corner of my screen. Larry, I'd love, you've got your hand up, but Andrew, is that okay if you go to Larry?
Absolutely, Larry. Why don't you ask the first question, Larry?
No, I want to hear what Larry thinks. And then
I want to hear what Larry has to say too. He may disagree with me, and we're very good friends. We have offices next to each other.
Bill, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I really have a question. What is the current thinking in Washington on the notion of either a no-fly zone or support for a Ukrainian insurgency if it comes to that? And thank you again. You've done a terrific job in every job you've ever had. We've been friends for a long time, and I appreciate you taking the time with us.
Larry, I wish you and I had planned to get together if I were there in person. And I'll take a rain check. I'd love to get together when I get back there. Andrew has already said I could come, so I will look forward to that. So, Larry, great question on the no-fly zone, and it's a debate. It's a real debate. Although the U.S. government is pretty clear. The U.S. government has made it very clear, much to the anguish of the Ukrainians. And much to the disappointment of many people in Washington, where, as I say, the debate rages. But the U.S. government is not given any indication that it's willing to take a step towards a no-fly zone. Now, just to explain what we're talking about here, the Ukrainians, as I say, are fighting valiantly. They're outmanned, they're outgunned, they're out aircraft, they're out ammoed. And where they're particularly vulnerable is in the sky. And they have been beseeching us and NATO as part of NATO, but they're coming straight to us, but also going to other NATO allies to just declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine so that the Russian Air Force would not be able to dominate the skies. Number one, so far, just to make it clear, the Russian Air Force is not yet dominating the skies, which is a mystery to most military observers. The strategy when you're invading a country is to get air superiority right away, and this applied to the Russians as well, and they didn't do it. They've not done it. The Ukrainian Air Force is still in the sky. Is still doing its job, but it is greatly outmanned, out aircraft. So the Ukrainians have asked, please just close off the sky so that we can have a chance of fighting, of defending ourselves. And we've done it. Larry and Andrew and others on this call. Well, no, we've done this before. We had a no-fly zone over part of Iraq. We had a no-fly zone a couple of times that we've been able to do it, but never against the Russians. And there's the key. If in order to declare, it's not enough to declare that we're going to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, you have to enforce it. And you have to do two things to enforce it. Number one, you have to take out air defense on the ground. You can't allow the Russians to establish air defense on the ground to be able to shoot down either Ukrainian or NATO aircraft. So you have to take out that. And that is an act of war. And number two, if the Russians do fly into this no-fly zone with their jets, you have to, if you're going to enforce it, you have to shoot them down. And that's an act of war. And what President Biden has said, and it's hard to argue, the Ukrainians do argue, but it's hard to argue with President Biden where he says, we don't want to fight the Russians. This is not our intent. So we're not putting troops on the ground at this point. We're not putting aircraft in the skies. We're not doing a no-fly zone. And so that's been very clear. But Larry, the argument on the other side is as I've said, mainly coming from the Ukrainians. I put my name to a proposal that General Breedlove and Kurt Volker, whom we know, proposed, which is, look, okay, not over the whole country, but where there are humanitarian corridors that are negotiated between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and these corridors are meant to allow civilians to leave cities that are besieged and are bombarded and that are being squeezed off, allow those humanitarian corridors to exist and declare a no-fly zone over them as a demonstration, but that is not going to be approved, Larry.
So the argument John Mearsheimer makes and other structural realists make is that the balance of power argument that is devoid of moral reasoning and does not talk about what's right or wrong, but simply it's the ancient Greek Melian dialogue between the Athenians and the island of Melos, and it's in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars. It's a very famous incident where the Athenians tell them the Melians must join the Athenian alliance against Sparta or else, and they refuse to join. And they lay siege to the island. They kill all the men to put the women and children in slavery. And the Athenians say, the weak must, the strong will do what they will, and the weak will suffer what they must. A very famous incident. And that's the basis for the realist argument, that we need to deal with reality as it is. But that this is part of Russia's sphere of influence. My question to the realists, and I ask you this, I know you don't take that view. I certainly don't take the view. I am not a neocon at all, but I think that if you let aggression go without responding, you are going to have a world war later, and it could be much, much worse than what we have now. The way to stop the Russians is what we're doing now. I don't think we should be in a position to shoot down Russian planes. So I hesitate agreeing with President Biden, because I do think he's done a good job uniting the NATO allies, but I think the reason we're fighting all this is because of what happened in Afghanistan. And that was incompetence on his part, in my view. But anyway, the question is, if we look at it from a purely realist, where is the limit? Where is the sphere of influence? Is it all of Europe? Do we say to the Russians, okay, we don't want to have a conflict of view. We recognize you have interests, and the interest is all of Europe. We're going to take NATO down, we'll destroy the European Union, and Russia can do whatever they want in Europe. I mean, what is the structure of power that is acceptable in a realist argument? It's never been clear to me. Are we supposed to do what we did to Poland, abandon them to the Soviets and the Nazis before the Second World War? Is that what we're going to do again? You know, when Gorbachev was asked, Bill, who collapsed the Soviet Union, he didn't say Ronald Reagan and George Bush or the Germans. He said John Paul II and the Poles. They are the ones. I think part of this is Putin and the Russian leadership, the oligarchs. They want revenge against the Poles for collapsing the Soviet Empire. And the Poles are not going to give in. I got to tell you, they're not going to go through what they went through before. So the question is, where is this all going to end? If we do not intervene now in the way we are, we could have a much broader war where we will be forced to intervene. But that's my view. And How do you answer the realist argument that we really should deal with reality and the balance of power and not worry about what's moral or immoral?
Andrew, I answer them in a very similar way that you just did. That is, there is a real strength. We are seeing right now. You talk about the Poles that wouldn't accept this. The Ukrainians will not accept this. Ukrainians will fight. The Ukrainians, there are 44 million Ukrainians, and that's they all now. You just mentioned how Putin has unified NATO. Putin has unified Europe. Putin has unified Ukraine like nothing, like no other Ukrainian leader ever. I mentioned that before the invasion, there were real politics, and there were people who were thought about going towards Russia or going towards Europe. No longer. After 2014, that changed, and in 2022, today, the Ukrainian people are united in their hatred for Putin, and they want again. This is right or wrong. This is clear. They want their freedom. They want their independence. They want their sovereignty, and they've got on their side those values, and those values, I think, will be stronger than the realists would posit. So I take your argument. Andrew, the only thing I would adjust, the only amendment I would make to your argument is that yes, probably Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, but he really has focused and has been obsessed with Ukraine. Ukraine is, of course, the biggest of the Soviet Socialist republics, the biggest component of the now dissolved Soviet Union, and the richest and the most historically important. But he has been focused on that all this time, and if he gets that, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, if Russia dominates Ukraine, then they are an empire, and empires don't stop. Exactly what you said, Andrew. And that's the realist argument. Okay, we can take it from there.
There's one other argument that is I only found one evidence of it on the internet anywhere. Ukraine and Russia both are two of the greatest agricultural production because they have so much land. I mean, the richness of Ukrainian soil is what attracted Hitler. People forget 1 million Germans died in World War I of starvation. Hitler was obsessed with food. That's one of the major reasons that he invaded the Soviet Union, is he wanted that land to grow food, and he was going to enslave the Ukrainians to do it. If Putin takes Ukraine and suppresses the population sufficiently, he will control 30% of the corn and wheat exports in the world, according to this article. If you combine the Russian and the Ukrainian, they could manipulate food prices across the world, which would cause chaos in the international agricultural system that feeds the world. It would be more powerful in some ways than nuclear weapons, because if you tripled food prices overnight, imagine what would happen around the world. We had that happen, by the way, a substantial increase in 2009, and there were revolutions and coups all over the world as a result of that. And so there is another issue here. It's an economic issue where Putin would be controlling an enormously powerful force, and that is the food supply of the world. So that's not been discussed at all, but I do think that's what originally was one of his conclusions. One of the things that I think he's doing, Bill, which is very dark, but I mean, I think he's a war criminal, but I think he's bombing these cities to cause a massive refugee movement out to depopulate Ukraine. So there are 10 or 15 million Ukrainians that move to Western Europe, which will cause chaos. Where do you put 15 million people? In most civil wars around the world that last a long time, the general displacement of population is about 25%. It was 35% in Syria. It was so bad. Imagine if 12 million people, that's 25% of Ukraine, left for Western Europe. What would that do to Western Europe? It would be chaotic. And more importantly, it would depopulate large parts of the Ukraine. Now, I think that's one of the reasons they're bombing these cities. But again, we'll see.
We will indeed. We will indeed.
Yeah.
Other questions, Andrew?
Yes. Let me ask another question. Where is China in all this? The fact that they did not vote with Russia is astonishing to me. But it's understandable because I worked with the Chinese envoys to resolve the crisis in Darfur when I was President Bush's envoy to Sudan. And the Chinese rule is don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. China recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign state. So the Chinese are in a very bad position right now. Can you comment at all? What are you hearing about the Chinese? Are they trying to pull away from Putin? Are they putting pressure on him? What's going on with the Chinese?
It's a great question, Andrew. It's a great question, and yes, this is a really important one. So we remember that President Putin visited Beijing at the beginning of the Olympics, and he and President Xi got together and they put out another 5,000 word document that said that there's no limit on the on the alliance or the relationship or the partnership or whatever they call it. But it's very interesting. Gets to your point. The word Ukraine did not appear in that 5,000 word document because of what you said, Andrew. The Chinese say, they got other big problems. We got other problems with them, but they tend to respect sovereignty. At least, they will nod to that. Number one. Number two. They don't like interfering in other other nations. They're violating sovereignty. That's another principle that they try to. They violate it as well. But number three, and this is probably the most important one. The Chinese have a lot of investments. I think the Chinese are the largest single investor in Ukraine. When I was there in 2019, there were concerns. There were a lot of concerns coming from Washington. Washington would call, let me know. I was the acting ambassador out there, and one of the concerns that Washington had that they wanted me to do something about was growing Chinese influence in Ukraine. Investments, buying up companies, buying up good companies, high-tech companies, and taking over ports, investing in railroads. The Chinese again are the largest single investor in Ukraine, and so they were not eager to see this invasion. They famously said don't invade during the Olympics, but they also had other reasons. And the last thing, Andrew, I'll say about this, and others will have views about this, is that I think you're right that that President Xi and probably President Putin looked at our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Not both how it was done, but also the withdrawal itself. That is, what did it say about the Americans' willingness to remain engaged in the world? And Putin and Xi might well have thought, aha, the Americans are pulling back. They don't have the stomach for this. We do, they will tell themselves. And the Americans don't. And so President Putin may have tried to test that. I think he's made a big mistake. I think he's made a big mistake on that for all kinds of reasons that we've already talked about a lot. This was a blunder on Putin's part, and he will regret it because in the end, let me be clear, in the end, in those scenarios that I've just laid out, Ukrainians win. It may take a long time. Ukrainians will prevail. So Putin will have been seen to be a loser, and he'll probably end up in The Hague, as Andrew says. This is a war criminal like Milosevic and other war criminals of the previous century. So China is probably watching very carefully, and they're probably a little surprised, like Putin is undoubtedly surprised at the strength of the pushback, the strength of the alliance, the strength of the Biden administration. They didn't expect that. The strength of Zelensky. Putin didn't expect that. And so President Xi is watching all that with surprise and a bit of dismay. And I bet you he's having second thoughts about designs or early designs on Taiwan. He's got to be worried that the Americans are indeed back.
President Putin threatened, and I quote, severe consequences like you have never seen before if we intervened and armed the Ukrainians, which we have done, and united NATO. What does that mean? Do the Russians do this? They just threaten all the time, or is there some substance behind the threat?
This is a good question, and it goes this whole kind of nuclear threat, the threat that Putin has has hinted at, and some of his people have been explicit about this. Well, Putin has even been explicit. He said, you have to remember, we're a big nuclear power, as if anyone had forgotten about that. So he has pointed this out, and he's made those kind of threats, Andrew. And so then one question that comes up, and there are a series of issues surrounding your question. One of them is this man rational? Is he a madman? And there's an argument. I mentioned to Larry Napper that there's an argument about the no-fly zone. There's also an argument or disagreement or just different evaluations of the answer to that question about Putin's mental capacities and mental state. And some people like, Condi Rice and Mike McFaul and President Macron, for that matter, who have been up close to him, but before and after, currently and previously, and have said, this is a different guy. This guy is, something's off here. Condi said that he's unhinged. And that may be. The other argument is that no, he's actually still rational. He has a different calculation about cost and benefits. A rational person, in my view, or in many of our views, would have taken a look at the cost that he's having to pay for invading Ukraine, in terms of support for himself at home, in terms of the international program, the effect on the economy. All of these things were clear to him, and yet he invaded. And so we say, is he irrational? No, he's not. This argument is he's not irrational. He has a different weighting system or different calculation of the cost and benefits. But in that sense, in that argument, he's not suicidal. He's not suicidal. He's not going to start a war, a nuclear war, because the Ukrainians are getting support from the West. That's in this argument that won't happen. So it's a good question, Andrew, about his mental state, his threats. He also has said that the economic sanctions are a declaration of war, and he's also talked about genocide. I mentioned earlier that he had tried to find some reason, some rationale, some justification for invading Ukraine, at least to give to his own people, if not to try to convince the world. He couldn't. And so he had to reach into, there are neo-Nazis in Kyiv. They are committing genocide in Donbass. Just ludicrous. They know it's crazy. And but that's the kind of language you use if you're trying to say that this could require the direst of circumstances, the direst of responses. I think there's a lot of show in that, Andrew, a lot of theater, a lot of bluster, a lot of, I won't say bluff because he could do it. Fiona Hill said, famously, he could do it. And she knows him much better than I. But I think it was an attempt to get Zelensky, Biden, NATO to fold. And he has not gotten Zelensky, Biden, NATO to fold. They are continuing to resist.
So if people want to help the Ukrainian people who are suffering, what's the best way to do that? Has there been discussions about the UN intervening with some of the World Food Program, or the UNHCR, the major NGOs, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross? What's the mechanism through which we could work?
As you just listed, a lot of the mechanisms, Andrew, that are part of the international response to disasters, and they are all those organizations are engaged. There are I've seen probably hundreds of well-curated lists of non-governmental organizations, of other service organizations, of journalists that can be that need support, where you can support by donating, by providing funds. And these are, I was at a fundraiser yesterday, I was at a fundraiser previous to that. There are a lot of these, probably in Houston as well, where there are people who are concerned about what's going on and willing to take action to either raise money. I have a good friend whose wife is in Poland on the border. She's helping. She speaks like three Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, English, of course, and so she's helping refugees. So there are people actually going there to help. The Poles, by the way, are distinguishing themselves. They are heroes on their border as well, accepting, as Andrew said, these hundreds of thousands, now millions of Ukrainians who have come across the border into Poland and into Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. But the Poles in particular have probably taken easily probably a little more than half of all of those Ukrainian refugees coming across. So there are those kind of service organizations that you can either volunteer for or fund. One last thing, there's a lot of it is information, and the information that will never penetrate the Russian information sphere, and they've got that. However, Russian people are starting to figure this out. The ones that can go on the internet, they're starting to understand what's actually happening. But independent journalism is an important component of this fight. Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian, has said that journalists are the heroes of our time because they find out things and they help us figure out what is true by a lot of different angles on what is true. So there are a lot of ways to contribute, and everybody has an opportunity. There have been reports of, and I'm not sure these are intelligence reports or some good journalist that I just said we should support has been tracking this down. But we know it has been reported that there are these Russian special forces who were already in Ukraine even before the invasion. We also know that Putin has enlisted Chechens who are ruthless as the Russians, and has recruited them to try to take out President Zelensky. And this is so interesting. There have been at least 3 attempts on President Zelensky's life by these groups. And the report is, this is so interesting, the report is that the Russian military intelligence tipped off the Ukrainian forces to be on the alert for these attempts at Zelensky's life. Now, it just blows your mind. But this is the Russian military intelligence tipping off the Ukrainians to be careful because the Russian forces are trying to do exactly what you said, that is to kill Zelensky. Now, your last point was, if that's what they're trying to do, then why don't we take out Putin? Well, those are two different questions. And there is some morality. I mean, Andrew has talked about why we have values, and we don't take out the leader of the enemy. And he is now the enemy. There's no doubt about that. But that's not what we do, at least any longer. Maybe we did it. I don't know if we did it in the past. I don't know, but we don't do that any longer.
Well, I would like to go on, but we're well past the time. I do want to thank you, Bill, for being with us. Ambassador Taylor was going to come out and visit us, and then he's been called so many times for advice and counsel. I'm glad you're there, Bill, because you're a steadying voice